we're going to go ahead and get started. With one last reminder, if you're not speaking, to please have your audio on mute. Well, thank you everybody for joining our webinar for journalists on covering Habitat 3. I'm Christopher Swope. I'm the managing editor of Cityscope, and I'll be your moderator for the next hour or so. Cityscope is an online news site covering urban innovation in cities around the world. For a little more than a year, we've been keeping a very close eye on something we think is a pretty big deal for cities and the future of cities. That's Habitat 3. This is a conference that the United Nations puts on once every 20 years. It's the one time every 20 years that nations come together to discuss and debate the future of their cities. The next one is to be held in Quito, Ecuador, in just about 4 months' time. That's in October. So we think that Habitat 3 is kind of a big deal, and it's related to some other very big deals that some of you may be covering and reporting on, such as the Paris Climate Agreement and the new Sustainable Development Goals. So my goal for today is to moderate a discussion that will help journalists around the world understand, why is this a story? How can I connect this story to my audience? And we're going to try to keep this very conversational, leave lots of time for questions. And on the point of questions, we're still navigating the technology of this event here. So we think the easiest way to get questions asked and answered will be if you can take to Twitter, and you can submit questions for our panelists via Twitter using the hashtag H3Journalism. H3Journalism. And just one more reminder, if you're not speaking, if you can just have your audio on mute, please. I'm going to do some brief introductions of our panelists and then try to set the stage for the conversation and then move into the roundtable. We've got 3 fantastic panelists with us today, and I'd encourage you all to think of them as sources for your stories. Each of them represents organizations that are leaders in the quest to make cities places for all their people. And we at Cityscope lean on these folks constantly for insight. We lean on them for example to cities that are doing innovative things, and I think you should too. First, here at the World Bank in Washington, we have our host, Eddie Vazquez. The World Bank is one of the sponsors of this webinar, so we'd like to thank you for helping us do this. Eddie is the Senior Director for Social, Urban, Rural, and Resilience Global Practice. So Eddie and his team cover a lot of ground here at the bank, but the important thing to know is if you want to know what the World Bank is doing on cities, this is the guy to go to. Second, joining us at Brussels, we have Billy Cobbett. Billy is the Director of Cities Alliance, which is a global partnership for reducing poverty in cities. Cities Alliance also promotes the role of cities in urban sustainable development. Billy's team is doing a lot of really important work in cities across the global south, just one example of which is a program in Uganda that we highlighted recently in Cityscope, looking at how to build planning capacity in secondary cities in Uganda, and actually I think the World Bank is a partner in that effort as well. Our third speaker is joining us from New York. That's Ana Moreno. She's the coordinator of the Habitat 3 Secretariat. That's the organization that responds to Habitat 3. Ana knows literally everything about Habitat 3, the process up to now, what milestones lie ahead, the road to Quito, and what comes after. So we're very pleased to have her here today. And I should also say the Habitat 3 Secretariat is also a sponsor of this webinar. We'd like to thank them very much for helping us put this on. And one more reminder, just if you're not speaking, please have your audio on mute. We're getting a little bit of background noise. So to get us started, I'm going to give just a really quick thumbnail sketch of what Habitat 3 is and where we are in the process, and then we'll dive into some questions and do this as sort of a roundtable. And just one more reminder on how you can ask questions. Please submit them over Twitter using the hashtag H3Journalism. Habitat 3, as I said earlier, is the UN's major convening on cities. The last one was Habitat 2. That was in Istanbul in 1996, and the very first one was in Vancouver in 1976. This year's conference is in October, from the 17th to 20th of October, and it represents the culmination of a process that has been going on for more than a year now. There have been meetings all around the world on different thematic issues, such as municipal finance, regional governance, public space, informal settlements, and other issues. There have been meetings looking at urbanization from more of a regional perspective, and some of the journalists joining us today have covered these meetings from Cityscope. All of these meetings produced declarations, and these declarations and other inputs have been rolled up into a document called the New Urban Agenda. This is the ultimate outcome document that nations will agree to at Habitat 3. But first, in must negotiate, and that's what's happening now. The first draft, or the zero draft of the New Urban Agenda came out last month. There have been many hearings going on at the UN. Local authorities came to offer their feedback. Civil society organizations did as well. Now the real negotiating between countries is underway at the UN, and a second draft of the New Urban Agenda came out just a few days ago, and there'll be more revisions coming in the next few weeks. One final thing I'd like to note about all of this is that, unlike, for example, last year's Paris Climate Agreement, the New Urban Agenda is not binding. So it represents a set of aspirations more so than commitments. But again, as I said earlier, it's also become quite intertwined with the climate agreement as well as the SDGs and some other UN agreements that have a lot of momentum behind them. So with all that said, I'd like to start off with really the most basic of questions, and I'd like all of our panelists to answer it, and that is, why is Habitat 3 a story that journalists should care about? And for that, I wanted to start with our host here, Eddie, and if you could take that, and then we'll go to Billy and Anna. Why is Habitat 3 a story that journalists should care about?
Thank you, Chris. I think three main reasons. First, urbanization is one of the most important global trends that we see are going to define at a global scale changes for developing countries over the next couple of decades. And therefore, we all talk about technology change, we all talk about climate change, but we believe that urbanization is one of those critical global trends that journalists need to monitor. Second, we just crossed the threshold for the world to be urbanized. We are a little over 50%, and the rate of urbanization is actually growing really fast. Therefore, the way in which nations are shaped in developing countries depend a lot on how their cities grow. But also in developed countries, in Europe and in North America and in some of the other developed countries, cities are really taking the lead on action for some of the most important global problems, all the way from climate change to unemployment, to crime and violence, to issues of absorption of refugees and displaced people. Finally, this is a conference that is a landmark on the urban space because it only takes place every 20 years. And this is one opportunity to look at completely new trends and catching up with the most recent thinking on how urbanization needs to proceed over the next 2 decades. And what is really important is that the decisions that nations and cities and mayors make over these next 20 years are going to be having an impact not only for a few years ahead or for a couple of decades, but we believe for a century or more. The shape of cities today, like Paris and London, is the same one that they had 150, 200 years ago. The way in which cities grow today and the decisions that they make in terms of shape, form, density, use are going to be having consequences for the next century or so. So these are three important reasons why we believe that journalists should be paying a lot of attention to Habitat 3.
Great, thank you. Billy Cabot, we'd like to go to you next. Take that first very basic question. Why is Habitat 3 a story?
Thanks, Chris. And I'll build on what Eddie's already said and not repeat. The first is in your introduction that it's intertwined with the SDGs in Paris. And I would like to say that Quito is critical in answering the question, to what extent are we able to mobilize sub-national governments, local and regional governments, to contribute to the delivery of the global agenda that was agreed in 2015. So up until now, I would think of regional and local governments really as the missing army, the missing troops to deliver these global goals. The second reason is how dramatically and how quickly the world has changed in the last 20 years. In the 20 years since Habitat 2, the shape and profile of the world's cities, by cities I mean cities of all sizes, including small and medium-sized cities, is changing dramatically. In many countries, cities, urban spaces are doubling in size in as little as 15 years. And if we don't have a clear understanding of how to respond and what the key issues are, we are going to be in desperate trouble. And the third point, which is related, and this is the one I'd like to discuss with our journalist friends, is that most national governments are not responding adequately to the needs of their cities, nor are they recognizing adequately the role of local and regional governments in making the contributions that I've been referred to. So one of the things that we'll be looking for in Quito is what is the level of political commitment and political support in what is ultimately not a competing developmental agenda, but one joined up developmental agenda. That's really what we're trying to achieve in Quito. I'll stop there because of the noise.
Thank you, Billy. And I think the noise hopefully is taking care of itself. Apologies again for all of that. Next to Ana Moreno. Same question. Why is Habitat 3 a story?
Well, thank you. Good morning. And already mentioned by Ede and by Billy some of the key aspects of Habitat 3, so allow me to add to those ones. I think most interesting thing, apart of course, the demographic challenges and the governance issues of cities.
Now everything.
Important.
How we hear you.
Of course, will be key in order to look at urban solutions, what is happening all over the world, and how important is going to be to agree on a consensus on trying to change the paradigm of how we are building, planning, and managing our cities. So first aspect is, as Billy was mentioning, is are we ready to agree on that change of paradigm? Second, are we ready to discuss about the urban solutions to the pressures and the crises that are daily coming to our cities, and how are we going to involve citizens on that? So I think the awareness part of the Habitat 3, it's really important. It's about building accountability, transparency, and fighting about corruption also in our cities. So it's all what Ede and Billy were mentioning, but we also believe that it's a building, it's an investment on accountability and on awareness for citizens to be aware about how their cities are built, managed, and planned for the next years and for the next generations. And we need to understand that the young generations of Africa and Asia are mainly urban, and it will be key for them for the next decades.
Great, thank you, Ana. I'd like to pick up a little bit. I think Billy might have been pointing to some of where I wanted to head next, which is really about tension. And I think journalists like stories that have tension in them. Where's the fighting? Where's the arguments? I think one thing that made the Paris climate talks not just an important thing for the world, but also a good story for journalists was that there was very clear fault lines. Are we aiming for a 1.5 degree climate target or 2 degrees? That's a very kind of clear storyline to kind of understand. And I'm wondering, what are the storylines here? What are the disagreements about? And Billy, maybe I could go to you first on that, because I think you hinted at one of the ones that I've been picking up on, which is basically the sort of tension between sort of, I guess, local authority and national prerogative.
So that is clearly one of them, and let me return to that. The new urban agenda, like all of the negotiations of last year, is ultimately negotiated between member states. In other words, it's national governments that negotiate that. But what they're negotiating and discussing is, in fact, to do with the role of subnational governments. And I stress the both in regional and national. So the amount of authority, responsibility, and resources available to local governments within a national framework is, in fact, not a new tension, but is one of the abiding tensions in the discussions around the new urban agenda. And if I can say that there's a whole spectrum of opinions and practices across national governments, but in those countries where we see the greatest changes in the balance between rural and urban economies, historically we have found that the role of local government is given least credence, and very often is regarded as, to some extent, inferior. In other words, national governments where the action is and local government is very often treated as little more than an administrative arm of higher government. So that's one tension. The other tension is over the definition of the city and access to the city. And in particular in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and in Asia, with the rapid growth of cities, both from natural population growth and in terms of rural-urban migration, with this growth in population, in a small r, the rights of, in particular, the urban poor to access services to be formally provided for in the city, to be recognized as long-term citizens and residents, is another contested point and point of tension. So there's one on the vertical access between national and local government, but at the city level itself, there is often a tension between the urban poor and the city authority. And finally, these are of the tensions is what are the instruments that anticipate this future urban growth? Because if we learn anything from Latin America, and it's visible, is that most planning and investment takes place after the event. And the question is, to what extent can the new urban agenda help local governments to get ahead of the curve, both in terms of infrastructure and governance? And those are some of the big tensions that are implicit and explicit in the discussions.
Interesting. Anna, I'd like you to maybe pick up on that as well. You mentioned recently that in Habitat 2 that the subtext was that cities are kind of a problem, and we need to sort of clean up this problem. I'm paraphrasing you there. Sorry, but the difference between Habitat 2 and Habitat 3, where the subtext is that cities are perhaps the solution, or could be the solution in terms of growing incomes and getting people out of poverty if we do it the right way. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but could you speak to that a little bit? I mean, how is this sort of changing view of cities influencing the discussion that we're having with Habitat 3?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I think, in fact, one of the tensions is there. I don't think we have achieved that there is an agreement about urban issues. In fact, even local authorities is not universally, decentralization is not everywhere, and that's really important to understand. And this Habitat 3 hopefully will be putting some pressure in national governments in some countries to start to think, and as I was mentioning before, to have accountability to citizens why cities don't have the tools in some cases and in some countries. Because it's not obvious everywhere, and there are quite a number of places that they don't have that capacity, even the lowest level of decentralization. Then, coming back to your question, Habitat 1 and Habitat 2, in a way, were conferences anti-urbanism. There were a lot of discussions about the negativity of cities, and there were discussions about a dichotomy between rural and urban, about migration coming to cities, about how to stop people to go to cities. This time we are not talking about that. This time we are talking about the reality that is there, for sure. It was also there in 1996. And we are talking about how to improve opportunities and how to improve the way that we are managing and building cities. Hopefully, the discussion will be focused on that. And that means that we will be talking about the positive aspects of urbanization. For the first time in history of the United Nations, urbanization is considered part of the development agenda. It never happened before. That's the first time that it's in the SDGs, and that especially in Paris Agreement, even though it's not obvious in the document, but it was clear in the meeting that local authorities' role was going to be really important. So hopefully this discussion is not only about Quito, it's about after Quito, beyond Quito. So media will have also a really important role on monitoring, on watching what is going to happen in different places of the world and in different cities. And we are talking about these positive aspects in terms of urban economy, in terms of urban governance, and in terms of urban legislation that in a way Billy was already mentioning, and we can talk later on.
Okay, Eddie, do you want to take that?
Sure. Look, I mean, tensions, lots of tensions, because when you have these massive transitions, then sometimes there are winners and losers, and sometimes the actual implementation doesn't catch up with reality. For example, land. In order for a city to be efficient, to be low carbon, to be effective, needs to manage its land really well. But all issues of vested interest, migrants coming into unregistered land becomes a source of tension for a city. Second, for many cities, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, crime and violence becomes a really important tension. A city that wants to be competitive and productive is dragged down by issues of crime and violence in a variety of dimensions, by exclusion, by gangs, by unemployment in the youth. Another tension that happens very frequently, and that we're seeing a lot now, that this is a year where we're paying a lot more attention to refugees and displaced populations, both internally and across countries. And what many people don't know is that half of the refugees and 60% of the internally displaced people actually live in cities. And cities are therefore having these tensions between the populations that live already there and those massive migrations that are coming. And therefore mayors are trying to balance that act of provision of services, absorbing the populations, registering them, allowing them to work or not, and interesting tensions that I think is something important for the journalists to try to understand, both at the city level but also as global trends.
So can I just come back to it though? The Paris Climate Agreement, the 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees, very sharp and clear. Is there anything analogous to that in this debate that sharpens what the focus of the future of cities and the future of urbanization is all about? Anything come to mind?
Well, actually, by 2050, if you are going to have 2 billion more urban residents, and realizing that there's more than 1 billion current residents that live in slums, are those 2 billion going to be living in slums or not? That's the big question. How, and that's part of SDG 11, are cities going to be able to provide decent housing for these large migrations or not? And that's the real challenge in terms of a practical number.
Anna, you want to respond to that? 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees. Is there any kind of parallel in the current discussion about Habitat 3 that is as sharp as that?
No, I think as I was mentioning, we are not in the state even of having that conversation. There is a lot to do first to focus and to get a consensus. It didn't happen. In fact, for this 1.5 agreement in Paris, it came 20 years. It has been since 1992 in Rio that it has been an investment, an effort of introducing all the challenges of climate change at different levels. So most important right now is to make everybody aware of what it means to plan cities. It's not there. It has been lost for the last 20 years. There is no, there is no recognition about the professionals, the urban planners, or the architects in some cases, about the knowledge of building cities, of managing cities. It's not there, and we should first decide about that if we want to see our cities in the next years planned or not. And if we want them planned, we want them planned for the majority or for the minority. And that's the first decision. If we have that one, then we can talk about specific targets. And the SDGs is already putting some targets there about public space and about other aspects of urbanization. So it's not that the new urban agenda needs to reinvent targets. In fact, it's first to decide about, as I was mentioning, if we want to plan our growth, our urban growth that is going to happen, especially in Africa and Asia, or not. We just want to continue to build informally our cities and to have urban pools multiplying in different places of the world.
Thank you, Anna. So I'd like to try to find a way to localize this. I mean, journalists are often trying to find, big stories that we can localize that matter to our audiences, wherever our audiences might be. And so I'm curious, how do we take these sort of big picture issues, these big questions, 2 billion people moving to cities, will they live in slums or will they live not in slums? How do we localize this? What are stories happening at the local level that can be told in ways that resonate with our audiences. And for that one, I want to start with Billy, because I know Billy, Cities Alliance does so much work in cities throughout the Global South, and I've always found Cities Alliance to be just full of stories to tell. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how to take this sort of big discussion we're having about Habitat 3 and localize it in a way that if I'm a reporter in Bangladesh or France or Brazil, that there's stories to tell.
Thanks, Chris. Well, I think the general answer would be that urban populations in general and the urban poor in particular don't wait for UN conferences to decide on solutions to their problems. And so I think wherever we went in different parts of the world, and I can give you examples, is that we have tensions, pressures, demands for services, for recognition that leads to local solutions. I don't want to be idealistic about it, because we have seen one of the great stories, I think, is by looking at the whole, the case for subsidiarity is not special pleading for city governments. This is how it mustn't be understood. It really is the case for local solutions contributing to global problems. Because if we look at choose your city, choose your country, in not in the mega city, not in the capital, but in local areas, secondary cities where we've had, for example, organizations of the urban poor who have organized themselves either to solve their housing problems into self-help lending circles that lend each other money to try and provide short-term solutions to housing crises. And the question is, can these be scaled up? Or more interestingly, are using handheld smartphones to map their cities and use that information to go and negotiate with the local government around rethinking the way in which planning takes place in that city. That's been happening in dozens and if not hundreds of cities, for example. So I think the new urban agenda and the SDG framework is nothing more than a framework. But if we are going to have any chance of success, I believe, we want to see local innovations being encouraged, and where they really work, then those being scaled up, as opposed to providing a framework which then all local governments can deliver. So for me, the story is what's happening locally, what are the innovations, what is the one charismatic or powerful mayor doing to change the life in his or her city, but conversely, how is the absence of information, the absence of data leading to, for example, corruption, particularly around the issues of land, which Eddie has already pointed to. I can assure you that this story plays out in every urban locality in the world, but just in different ways.
Thank you. Eddie, you want to take a shot?
Sure.
How do I localize?
No. Here's one that I usually find that is most challenging, and that is the localization of climate change to the city. Because many of us tend to think that climate change are these big power plants and these big deforestation trends. And I'm not saying that that's important, but actually in the city, climate change becomes a practical reality on two fronts. First, on mitigation. We may think that what does climate change mitigation have to do anything with cities? Well, actually it has a lot to do with cities in very practical ways that affect citizens and mayors. Whether the public transport system works well or not has tremendous implications on the emissions from the transport system of the city, and it has tremendous implications at the global level. Whether the heating and cooling systems of the apartment buildings work or not have important implications both on the energy bills that the citizens and the cities need to pay, but also on the impact on climate change. Whether the local pollution, and we see cities after cities having really big smoke problems, all that black carbon has tremendous implication on climate change mitigation. So what we're beginning to see is that, look, climate change mitigation at the city level is not an abstract thing. If you really have a city that is efficient, that manages a lot of its natural resources in very practical ways, then that has tremendous co-benefits on the climate change side. Now, on the adaptation, we see cities after cities that have been more affected by floods, that are more being affected by droughts, and therefore having water crisis in serving the populations, and cities that are having more impact in terms of the heat waves. Therefore, the practical actions for a city to get better at getting better prepared for the floods getting better on a cooling strategy to deal with the heat waves that we're beginning to see precisely this week in the U.S. and a few weeks, a couple of months ago in South Asia. This is a really global problem that it becomes very practical at the local level, and whether the mayor's leadership and the engagement with citizens can take action is a very practical story of local relevance, but of global importance.
Ana, how about you? You're at the UN, obviously having to take the global view, but how would you suggest that reporters localize this story?
Well, allow me to continue a bit with still localizing, but there are conversations that are not taking place that are key for all these urban solutions to be implemented and to have space. And for example, when we talk about the urban governance, part of the success of a city or a management of a city is to keep continuity, to have a long-term vision change. And that has been clear in some places like Medellin, in some other places like Barcelona in this case. But we can find hundreds of cities where the long-term vision, independently of which is the political party there, it's so key. Then there are some countries that they have legislations that don't allow mayors to be more than 3 years. It's the case of some of the Latin American countries. So a mayor can just be 3 years there in power. In some other cases, they can be 4 years, but they cannot repeat. I'm not saying that a solution is to have the same mayor in different cities for a long time, but it needs to be rethought again. If citizens want a long-term, vision, there are some decisions to start to discuss, or some issues that they have never been touched as such, and they are kept like a kind of, right in a stone, and it's not so clear that is the best way to handle that. Of course, then it's about trust, it's about corruption, it's about other topics. But I think that is one of the issues that I hope journalists will also will look during this Habitat 3 conference in their countries. Then there are some other aspects also about localizing, but at the same time looking at the global perspective. That is what is happening in your country in terms of territorial planning. Is that there is a need in your country for a national urban policy? It's how is the government handling the different balance of infrastructure, of movement of people? So there is a need, there is not, there is already implementation. It happened, it didn't happen, it happened and it was a success, it was a failure, why? So that, I think it's also important. And that's more about, of course, urban planning. And it can be applied at the national level, but also at the local level. How is my city going to grow in the next 20 years? There is a plan. Who is thinking about that? Is the private sector already implementing some instruments or infrastructures? Is the public sector aware about those ones? It's the other rest of services aligned with that investment of the private sector. Who is deciding the form of the city? Is decided by public, by private, by a combination of public-private. So at the local level, there are so many question marks that I think normally they are not being, put on the day-to-day of citizens. And the final one perhaps is about legislation that sounds like really tough. Like, okay, now we're going to talk about urban legislation, but it's key because it's about land, it's about rights, it's about how you make the economy of the city an endogenous one, and how you make the city sustainable, because financially especially. So who is owning the land? Which are the instruments to really ensure that any infrastructure is going to be the value is going to be shared. So there are so many questions. A part of the urban solutions, practical solutions, that I think they have never been discussed. That even at the media level, we are even trying to have this discussion in different countries and they are long term. So I hope it's not just about what is happening specific in terms of urban solutions, but also which is the plan for the next years that I hope they will localize at the local, regional, or national level.
Thanks, Anna. I want to pick up on something you said, but first I just want to remind everybody to ask questions via Twitter using the hashtag H3Journalism. We'll come to some questions from you all if we get them soon. But I wanted to go back to something you said, Anna, about, I think you mentioned Medellin, which is obviously one of the cities that gets held up as a model, as a place that has changed itself quite substantially for the better in a relatively short period of time. And I'll ask this of all our panelists, but I'm curious just to start with you, Anna. Are there other cities that you would point to as models out there? I think as journalists, or I found in my career as a journalist that sometimes to write about a problem, you need to find someplace that's fixed that problem and has solved some of these problems, and looking to the leaders is often a great way to understand the problems in your own city. So I'm wondering, what's a city that you would point journalists to as a leader in solving some of these urban problems?
Well, I use Medellin because it's easy to use it, and in fact, it will be even better than me to explain some of the successes. But Medellin has this kind of examples of why a model can be successful, and any city that, as I was mentioning, has a long-term vision will be successful, and we can find several in the world. But it means a lot of commitment. It's kind of a social pact. I call that. It's a social pact. It's a moment that there is a decision of the citizens, the political sector, the private sector, to look at their city as a global integrated approach, and there is a kind of a continuation on that. Of course, I'm from Barcelona. I have been working also at the local level in the municipality, so I cannot choose that one. But at least I can explain to you that normally this kind of commitments of a long-term vision comes with a crisis, in fact. So there is a moment that the city says, okay, we have touched, we cannot go lower than this. It can be because of security issues, like it happened perhaps in Medellin. It can be in Barcelona, where 25% of the population was without employment, was unemployed in the 80s. It can be any other reason. And then you build that vision, and that vision can just work if you have tools at the legal level, at the planning level, at the economic level. And that's the only solution I have seen in my life in different cities. I have not seen any other magic, tool except that. So it's true that for that you need to take tough decisions, and you need to decide to tackle some of the discussions that I was mentioning. They have never been discussed. Taxes are something that nobody can want to discuss, but at the city level is so important. How are you going to keep the services of that city? The relationship with the national government is something that it's really important. So Medellin is one of them because of, and it's not a city that has finished. A city is not a perfect body. You never finish a city. It's changing. So it's not that you have the perfect city and then you lost that one and then you come back to the perfect city. No, you are managing. So Medellin right now, it's still building. They have a lot of things to do, but they managed to have that long-term vision and that social pact, independently of the political party that was on power.
Billy, what's your example of a city that's made some progressive changes in a relatively short period of time?
Well, I can give you a number, but I would again re-emphasize the point. Cities are never done. I mean, you are forever redoing them. A relatively short space of time historically, if you look at a city like Johannesburg that restructured, look at its past. It came from a divided Soweto, Johannesburg. Don't forget, apartheid was managed at a local level. The restructuring of the city, the restructuring of the way services have been provided, the redelimitation of the city to ensure that Soweto and Johannesburg became one city. This is an ongoing movie. They had a 30-year vision, and they will need a new 30-year vision. They had to restructure entirely the tax base, revenue collection, and allow for some redistribution within the metropolitan area. I wouldn't call it done, but I would say over 20, 25 years, they've made remarkable progress. Let me give you the name of a city that some of your people won't know, Jinja in Uganda. It's on the Nile. Through work that we supported, we now have a new relationship that has been established between the urban poor and the local authority, in terms of which local agreements have been reached to release land to allow the urban poor to build their housing stock. That's the beginning of a long-term transition which has to transcend the political cycle. 2 weeks ago, I was one of the judges for the Financial Times IFC Awards on excellence in city-led transformation, and highly commended was Harare. And this is a city as one would know, in Zimbabwe with a very difficult national environment. But even within that context, because of local leadership and the relationship struck up between the mayor and the urban poor, we have the urban poor referring to the city as a partner, and their lessons in slum upgrading that they are pursuing shared with 6 other cities in Zimbabwe. There are examples all over the world, and it's not always, the most successful examples are where local governments do it with the support of national government as opposed to despite national government. Just as very often it is the same case that local people make progress despite the local authority as opposed to preferably with the local authority. Those are the relationships fundamentally that we are trying to change.
Thank you, Billy. Eddie, do you have a city that you'd like to use as an example of what kind of change is possible?
Look, what I always say is that there's no perfect city, but there's always, for every problem that you find, a group of cities that have found practical solutions. So when you look at transit-oriented development, you can look at Curitiba in Brazil, and you can look at some of the Japanese cities that really have focused on figuring out how to do good land management, manage their populations, having effective transit systems. I like for whole city transformation in a couple of decades. You mentioned Medellin, and that's one important example. But if you look at what Singapore or Seoul were 30 years ago, many of them had serious slums that they had to deal with and serious pollution. And it is that continuity of action that you can show that it is possible to do within a few decades. On issues of solid waste, many people think that this is just a technological solution, but I always give the example of Japanese cities, when in reality it is a social contract between neighborhoods, and in a way neighborhoods watch for solid waste to make sure that everybody recycles into this process. So there's not a single perfect city, but for any difficult issue, there are always mayors and citizens who have found practical solutions to learn from.
Thank you. I just want to remind everybody to ask questions via Twitter using the hashtag H3Journalism. Next question, so we'll start with Eddie. I'm curious, so one thing that Habitat 3 is a forum where nation states are doing the talking, but we're talking about urban policy, we're sometimes talking about metropolitan policies. Where is the change going to happen? Where, if change is going to happen as a result of Habitat 3 or via an intertwined process of the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement and other agreements coming together in a positive way, where should we expect the change to happen? Stories that journalists do tend to be about change, things that are happening. So where should we expect that to happen? Will that happen at the local level because a mayor takes something up? Will it happen at the national level because there's, I think, laws refer to new legal structures? Where should we look for change to happen, and therefore the stories about change to happen?
Look, you should also ask Ghana, because Habitat 3 is an important change in the process of participation from stakeholders beyond the nations. But coming to your question on the issues of where the change will happen, where we see the most effective change is where nation states come and say urbanization is important. No country has gone from middle income to high income status without having good urbanization. The processes of decentralization that we see in many countries are led by nations who say, look, many of these issues need to be solved at the local level. But that's not enough. If you don't have mayors and their technical teams with enough capacity for change, with a vision, with engagement with the citizens, then it doesn't happen. Let me, for example, give the example of finance. A lot of whether a city is going to be well run depends on whether the finances are there. And many people think, well, the finances is just what the nation transfers, and that is not clear. Unless the nations have transparent rules of transfers of resources from the state to the city, with clear predictability, with clear rules of the game, then it doesn't happen. But at the same time, unless the nations also give the cities the opportunity to raise their own funds, to have taxes and fees that are more appropriate to the local conditions, then it doesn't happen. And then if the citizens don't have a social compact with the mayors to say, yes, we will pay the taxes and fees in exchange for good services, for good provision of everything that the city needs to offer, then it doesn't happen. So these issues of whether the cities work depend on finances, and the finances depend on whether everybody contributes. The nations, the cities, the citizens.
Ana, could you take that one too? Where should we look to change? Where should we look for change to happen?
Well, I'm kind of reiterating some of the things that even Edith was mentioning now. The only possible real change can happen at the citizens' level. I mean, in the sense that if there is not that pressure and that conviction and that knowledge from citizens to ask about those changes to happen, it will not be relevant at all. Because, of course, national and local governments can start to take some decisions. But if you want me to say, how can we measure success of Habitat 3 in 20 years? So let's change the question to, how can we see if Habitat 3 was successful or not in 20 years from now? If a citizen is going to vote to a mayor or to a national government, and part of the questions on the program or the political program is about which is the vision for the city, how it's going to be planned, which is the model of business model for the city. So if all these aspects are clear for the citizens, they are voting, knowing what is coming for their cities, I think that will be a success. Of course, the quickest change should happen probably at the, as I was mentioning about decentralization or not. Are we going to have in those countries that they have not yet, decide which model of decentralization they are going to have? Are they going to implement this decentralization in the next years? It's something that they believe it should come. Will benefit there or not. So that's one thing that it's really interesting to see. The other one, it's about the knowledge. Are we going to be able to capture of this knowledge of cities and be able to share the different practices? And then, as I was mentioning, the third one, it's the awareness. I really believe, that unless we manage in 20 years to have this capacity of knowledge connected with the policy and connected with the accountability, it will not be a real paradigm change. The paradigm change can only happen in behavior change. So I'm really a believer of that.
Billy, I'm curious your reply to that one as well. Where does change happen? Where do you expect it to happen? Do you want it to happen at the local level, at the national level? Where do the issues that you see being so important, where will those be decided and changed, and where will those stories happen?
Well, it's not going to happen in alone, for sure, because when the Agenda 2030 came out, the SDGs, we did an analysis of it, and it demonstrated that for them to be successfully implemented, at least 60% of them will require a significant contribution by subnational tiers of government. So the first thing we have to overcome is this idea that it's in any way a competition between national government and city governments in the public sphere, or between cities and citizens. So we need a completely different approach to the way in which we approach these, address these challenges. I know that sounds warm and fluffy. The other thing that is critical, and let me give you two very, you asked me earlier for two examples of successful cities. I could give you two that we worked with, one with the World Bank and one with German cooperation, and then both of them now in ruins. One was Aleppo and the other one was Sana'a. So without peace, which is not part of this discussion, we're going to make no progress at the city or national level. And you can't have these discussions in isolation because city transformation and transforming people's lives requires constant action and clear policy allocation of resources over time, not in one sphere, not at one level. And to imagine that we can pigeonhole this either spatially or by a tier of government. So when the member states are negotiating the new urban agenda, they have to see that this is integral to delivering everything that they negotiated with and agreed to last year, both in Paris and in New York. And this is most evident on the issues of not only on economic growth, but the nature and form of economic growth that we're going to have, because we are going to have to completely rethink, much more than people have realized to date, how we produce and how we consume. And that's going to happen really at the city and household level. That debate hasn't adequately begun. And the other is the one that Eddie's mentioned, is climate change. And that is all of the bad decisions that have been taken by the way that our cities are growing are having a dramatic impact on climate change and making things worse while we are discussing it. So the key point for us to remember is that the window is closing and it closes once. So this urbanization will be largely done by 2050. What shape our cities are in and whether they are a net contributor or loser on the global equation, those are the questions that we're addressing right now. We don't have time.
A few minutes over, given the technical trouble we had earlier with the sound, and we've also got a couple of questions that have just come in, so I'd like to make sure that we have a chance to ask those. One is from, these are actually fairly similar questions, so we can try to take them together. One is from Ana Valmero, who I know has written for Cityscope. Some she'll actually have a story this week in Cityscope. She's in Manila, and she asks, how are developing nations in Asia and Africa doing in terms of providing models for city innovations? I think I'm going to combine that with the question from Patralika Chatterjee, who is in the area around Delhi. She asks for inspiring examples of populous, keyword populous, Asian cities where urban innovations are being successfully implemented. So I think we're looking for, we had the examples from Africa earlier. We have some examples from Asia, innovative cities, perhaps populous cities in Asia doing things that we should be watching. And I'll let anybody jump in if they've got one that they want to talk about.
Well, well-known examples would have been, again, over a timeline, is the likes of, you want populous, so we go to Bangkok, which counts as populous. The way in which Bangkok has not fixed, but certainly addressed its transport problems over the last 2 decades is very significant. And I have personally witnessed some of the finest upgrading programs along the canals, which, and big parts of Bangkok are actually under sea level. And so there have been incredibly innovative relationships structured between organizations of the urban poor and the Bangkok Authority. Eddie has previously mentioned Seoul, which is one of the great urban transformations globally and happened in a relatively short space of time. And it is, although one wouldn't want to copy everything that has happened, New Taipei was the winner of the award of the Financial Times IFC last week. And this is a new city trying to release pressure on the traditional Taipei. This is very much, I think, learning from the Seoul model, where you also saw significant deconcentration. But I think the big one to look at in Asia must be the way in which the cities on the eastern seaboard of China have been used to drive the economy, with plenty of mistakes, yes, but the fact that we delivered all of the poverty goals under the MDGs was largely done in one country alone, and that was in China.
Let me build on the last point from Billy, because at the level of wastewater treatment that they have, given their income level, is much higher than cities that we have seen anywhere else in the world. So their growth trajectory on that dimension is greener than even developed countries. Second, they've been able to provide housing solutions for rapid growth in a way that they don't end up with massive slums by having this process of construction of housing and focusing on provision of services. The most complex issues of air pollution is something that they're beginning to tackle. But what is really interesting about Chinese cities is the way in which they compete with each other. It is a mechanism by which certain indicators are agreed in the 5-year plan at the national levels, and then they get disaggregated to provinces and then to cities. And the objective of mayors is really to work with the industry, with the SOEs, with the citizens to achieve or exceed those targets. And those targets are not only economic growth, but also how green the city is. What is the level of wastewater collection and wastewater treatment? What is the level of forest cover around it? So by having those indicators and by having that laser focused attention on solving these issues, Chinese cities have been able to really solve many of these challenges. Now, the big challenge is to the future. I just came back from Shanghai, where we're working with them on the Shanghai 2050 strategy, where their challenge now is not solving these practical problems that they have solved in the future, but how do they become a global city? How do they become attractive to the global youth? How do they become competitive in a global arena? How do they become a more cultural city, a city with better space, a city with better quality of life that becomes competitive at the global level? So it's a fascinating process of transformation, and it's a country where, remember, every year 30 million people move to urban areas. So the clock ticks every second.
Right. I want to finish with a question for Ana Moreno, but first I just want to mention something called the Habitat 3 Journalism Project, which is something that Cityscope and the Guardian Cities and about a dozen or more other publications around the world that are covering Habitat 3 launched in recent months, and it's really a platform for journalists and publications that see the story here to collaborate, to share content if they want to, and to try to sort of both broaden and deepen the coverage of Habitat 3. So we're really excited about that, and that's something that both publications can be involved in as sort of organizations, but it's also something journalists can be involved in. We've got a Facebook group that we launched, and we're looking to get sort of journalists that are covering urban issues talking to each other, and hope that some collaborations and maybe even some freelance gigs can come out of that. So just wanted to point you all to that. You can go to our website, cityscope.org, and look for links to the Habitat 3 Journalism Project. And I'll also say we're looking to do another webinar later this year, perhaps in September, that will be pertinent to some of the issues kind of right ahead of Quito. But just to wrap up, Ana, could you give us just a little bit of a sense of the milestones ahead on the path to Quito? There are more news pegs and news hooks on the way, negotiations going on. Could you just give us a sense of some of the milestones on the road to Quito in October that journalists should be mindful of if they're covering the story?
Let me give a couple of milestones. First, as you were mentioning, is the document itself, the New Urban Agenda. It's, as you were mentioning, a non-binding document, but it's going to be a really important set of recommendations that national governments are going to agree, and local governments will be there together with the national government. So we have to remember that Quito, we will have the World Mayors Assembly just after also the Congress of UCLG, the Local Authorities Association in Bogota. So they will be present in Quito. So it's not that they will not be in the decisions. It's how much they will be able to implement. So the document, they have two milestones. First is New York negotiations that we are continuing those ones, especially next week. And then we go to Surabaya in Indonesia, the last week of July, 25th to 27th. And that's connected also with the questions about Asia. because it's going to be really important to have that discussion in Indonesia. We will have quite a number of ministers from that area, and I think it's going to be a really good opportunity also to be aware of more of the challenges of that region. Then that's the document itself. Hopefully we will go to Quito with nearly a negotiated document, or perhaps just with a few issues to be discussed. Of that document, the key aspects for sure are going to be about the relationship between the local national detention that you were mentioning, some of the tensions that Billy was mentioning also about the right to the city, the access to basic services, to adequate housing. So that is going to be really important in that document. Then we have other aspects of Quito that I think it's important for journalists to know. It's not just going to be a conference. It's the beginning of what we call a legacy of Habitat 3. It's the beginning of this kind of change of paradigm that we are advocating for. So in Quito, the idea is to also see what we call the Habitat 3 village. So urban solutions implemented in Quito that can be for Quito, so that they will stay there. So we will use different neighborhoods of the city to allow private sector, public sector, different institutions and organizations all over the world to intervene the city. So it will be really interesting even to see how Quito is an urban lab during that week. And it's an urban lab that it's a global urban lab. It's everybody will be able to give that practice. So I think it's important to know that. And then, of course, it will be an opportunity for the discussion on knowledge and policies. So the idea is that when we go to Quito, we don't go to continue the discussion about the document. We go already to decide about how to implement, which are going to be my partners in the implementation, with whom I'm going to find the money to implement, which other majors can accompany me in this change. So there will be several events. A lot of institutions will be discussing. We will have a kind of a World Urban Forum connected with the Habitat 3. We will have institutions like World Bank managing discussions so relevant like municipal finance, but others will be present. So there will be a conference with more than 30,000 people there. But as I was saying, UN should not be seen as a conference organizer. So it's not about the conference. It's about promoting change and consolidating alliances and action implementation for the future. So I think really important to think about Quito on that terms. And then for us, what is more important is what is happening after Quito. So we will keep, analyzing what is happening. And the idea is that in 2018, we will go to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, in 2018 in February, to see what we have done in this 1 year and a half that we will have from Quito up to Kuala Lumpur.
Thanks for that overview, Ana. And as I like to say, having been at the World Urban Forum in Medellin, it's like the Olympics of urbanism. So it really is a pretty exciting event. With that, I want to wrap up. Thank you to our speakers for staying a little later than we had anticipated. And also, what we'll try to do is follow up with people on here, and we'll email you the press contacts of all of these. So if you need them as sources going forward for stories that you know how to get to them. And with that, thank you very much, Ede. Thank you, Ana. Thank you, Billy, for joining us, and we'll see you all next time.